I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another episode of Postcards from a Dying World. This is either the 10th or 11th episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame mini-series. Now, longtime listeners to the show or viewers of the YouTube might be thinking, wait, did a season of Star Trek end? Well, one is almost about to end, so you'll be seeing these people again. And you just saw Issa last week. Well, you heard him, because we didn't have video for that episode, covering Big Trouble in Little China 2 in the unproduced podcast series. But my Star Trek Bridge crew is back here to talk about the Science Fiction Hall of Fame story, the 1944 Arena by Fredric Brown, which was adapted into an episode of Star Trek: The Original Series with the same title. One thing people should know about that process, if you're thinking that's strange, several pulp classic science fiction stories got Star Trekized during the original run, mostly by authors adapting their own stories. Robert Bloch did it twice. Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho. If you remember his Jack the Ripper episode, the Jack the Ripper Scotty episode, that was a short story that he wrote just about Jack the Ripper, and he just put Scotty in it. And repurposing his the Halloween episode with the lady with the little Enterprise, that was a short story that Robert Bloch turned into a Star Trek episode. So it happened. But before we get into that, let's talk about who Fredric Brown was, and we'll talk about the story. But first, we're going to get into some biography of who Fredric Brown was, because he was an interesting science fiction writer. So Robert Bloch, it's interesting that I mentioned Robert Bloch because I didn't plan this, but they were friends and they grew up, or they were from the same city, Milwaukee. And there was a science fiction club in the 1930s of science fiction writers who hung out and critiqued stories and traded, work and helped each other. And two of the members were Robert Bloch and Fredric Brown, who both became Star Trek writers. But Robert Bloch is most famous for writing the novel Psycho, which of course created, he's the man behind Norman Bates, is his most famous work. But in the 30s, he was a member of the Lovecraft Circle and was writing a lot of Lovecraftian stories. But they had a group called the Milwaukee Fictioneers. That was the name of their group. This is the second story in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series by a Milwaukee Fictioneer. Our first episode, the very first story in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, was Martian Odyssey by Stanley G. Weinbaum, who was also a member of the Milwaukee Fictioneers. So if this is your first time on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series because you came here for Star Trek, this book is the official Science Fiction Hall of Fame, as the stories were voted in by the members of SFWA, the Science Fiction Writers Association, in 1970. So in 1970, all the science fiction writers, the professional writers, got together and voted what were their favorite stories. And so all the stories in this book were selected by the voting members of SFWA in 1970. And so what's interesting is this story, Arena, comes in after The Huddling Place by Clifford Smack, but they were both in Astounding back-to-back months but Arena was in the month before, but we'll get into that, which is really fascinating that 1944 produced these two stories back to back. So, a little bit more about this unique relationship. Most of how I first discovered Fredric Brown myself, or really like started getting into him, was reading about him in Robert Bloch's autobiography, Once Around the Block, which I recommend. Is a really cool book about his history and writing and all that. And he mentioned that Fredric Brown was the kind of rock star of the Milwaukee fictioneers because he had like the most work published, and but really his this was during the 40s, a little bit later. They all started in the 30s together, but Fredric Brown was one of the ones who took off. Robert Bloch and Fredric Brown were the two most successful members of the Milwaukee fictioneers. And Fredric Brown sold his first story to a science fiction magazine in 1941, and Arena was his 17th story. So between 41 and 44, he sold 17 stories. But much like Tony Boucher, Fredric Brown had success in the mystery subgenre as well. And his first novel was actually a mystery novel called The Fabulous Clip Joint. But he also had a mystery novel called Murder Can Be Fun, which because part of Fredric Brown's thing is that he added a lot of humor to his science fiction and to his mysteries. And Arena is not a particularly super funny story, but his novels are. And so and particularly one that was his most kind of successful or famous science fiction novel. In 1949, he wrote a parody of pulp science fiction conventions called What Mad Universe. And it was a multiverse story featuring a pulp science fiction editor who gets accused of being a spy for Arcturus. And it's a pretty funny book for 1949. And I recommend it. But the best thing about it is he has a time traveling sewing machine in it. Yeah.
As one has,
As one has, yeah. So What Mad Universe is the only one of his novels that I've read. He also has one called The Lights in the Sky Are Stars that is about the space program, the United States space program, and it was written in 1952. So it's one I want to read because I'm curious what science fiction writer in 1952 was kind of projecting about the U.S. space program. And if you get a chance, and I might look for it later, but the author photo on the back of the 1949 edition of What Mad Universe, and that's what my library had. And by the way, when I checked it out from the library, I swear to you, I was like getting dust off of it. It came out of deep storage. I was the first person to check it out since 1987, according to the librarian, who actually went through the trouble of looking it up because they were so curious. Not kidding. And the about the author photo, he's like wearing devil horns, and it like underneath it says he's not an ARC spy or something like that. It's very funny. But
I mean, let's just hear it for libraries for having a book that can just sit there for 40 years and still be available. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I have been told more than once by my librarian that when I get holds, that I have many times been the frequent flyer from the deep storage. Thanks to another one was Charles Beaumont's The Intruder. I was told that they were the same thing. They were looking at it like, this is crazy, first edition from 1958. But what Mad Universe is actually older. So before we get into the issue of the magazine, well, let me show you the issue of the magazine and then we'll talk about the story. And I'm sorry you guys are having to do a lot of listening for a little bit here, but um, this is the cover for June 1944 Astounding Science Fiction. And the cover story is Trog by Murray Leinster. And Murray will be the next episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame with his story First Contact, I believe is the name of the title. But Murray Leinster, by the way, was published his first science fiction story long before the genre had a name in 1913. So Murray Leinster was regularly publishing fantasy stories, a decade before the term science fiction existed. So really, and so he's the headline author of this one. And this story, Trog, now this is interesting because keep in mind, June 1944. You guys have any idea what was happening in June 1944?
It's a mystery. I don't know what was going on then. It was probably quiet, not much happening.
Well, it was the month of D-Day. So we were right in the middle of World War II. And this cover story, Trog, is a story about the Nazis winning. And like all kinds of weird stuff that happens in a Nazi future. I have not read it, but I read about it. Here's the Listerine ad on the inside of the 1944 issue of Astounding. Now, this is the point where Alec Neville Ali wants me to always remind everyone that John W. Campbell had no control over the ads and was not a fan of them. And then we also have the International Correspondence Schools. And this is where you can learn about aviation, get above the crowd. I don't know how you could correspond to learn how to fly, but apparently, maybe back then. So this is the table of contents for this issue of Astounding. And if anybody wants to look at the actual magazine, it's on the Internet Archive. Thanks to people like Jesse at SFF Audio is one of those people who's been putting all these magazines up. I mean, a lot of people are doing it. Just Jesse's the first one that comes to mind. But we also have Trojan Fall, a story by Hal Clement, who was a very big science fiction writer at the time. But usually these magazines would have like 6 or 7 stories. But during World War II, there was a period when they were having trouble because, frankly, a lot of authors were, regular authors were off in fighting the war. And so only having 2 short stories and 2 novelettes is kind of thin for this issue. One thing that was also going on during this era of Astounding is that, and usually I look a couple issues forward to see what the letter section were saying about these stories, but during this year of Astounding, there's no letter section that I could find. So and the letter section was kind of like the internet of the science fiction era at the time. You'd have people sniping back and forth and arguing with each other, responding to certain letters and saying, I liked this story, I didn't like that story. And but for whatever reason, there's not a letter section here. So that's strange. But okay, so page 70 is where Arena was in the magazine. Now, did you guys read it? What source did you use to read the story? Starting with Issa.
I read the PDF you sent first. I think you sent the PDF and then you sent the magazine. So I read the PDF.
Sarah,
I don't know
what
where
was your source for reading it?
PDF.
Okay. And what I did was and what I've been doing with a lot of these is I pull out the Science Fiction Hall of Fame and I listen to an audio version while actually reading it, which I don't know. I only do that for this series, but um because there's a lot of audio versions of it, but I don't want to not look at the actual print of it because I want to catch certain things. But okay, so this is how it appeared um in the magazine. And the it was a weird sort of battle for survival, not only of individuals but against of individuals but against his will, um but each against his will represented his whole race, and the battle rested on ingenuity, tenacity, and courage, not strength alone. Forget the sexist language here for a bit, but I guess, do we know what the roller's gender was? Does he have a gender? Does he or she, it have a gender? I don't know. So, I don't, I'm not trying to be cavalier about it, but, I don't think that's said necessarily. But, um, first things first, this is a story from 1944. um, Oops, we lost Issa. I guess I'm going to Sarah first. Sarah, have you read much science fiction from the 40s, or was this a first experience with this era?
No, not at all. Not at least not that I'm aware of. Like I've read a bunch of, science fiction compendiums that would have various years in it, but over the years, but I remember looking at it and going, "Oh my God, like, you know, it's it sounds like it's from the 60s even without." And when I read this, even though I've seen the TOS episode many times, it is so different.
Yeah.
It's but even with as different as it is, it felt like I was reading a 1960s story, which I think is a compliment. So it's and it's it holds up unlike the episode.
Issa, what was your experience? Was this your first time reading something from the 40s? Because you've read a lot of
Now,
science.
I feel like I'd read when I was a kid, I'd read like every anthology of old science fiction that I could get my hands on. A lot of stories from the 40s and 50s for sure. I don't think I'd ever read this one. It didn't seem familiar, and I didn't even know that the Star Trek episode was from this. But yeah, like Sarah said, it really stands up well. It did seem very old to me. I mean, I actually thought it. I didn't realize it was from the 40s while I was reading it. So I was like, but there were a couple things that didn't sound like 60s turns of phrase. Um, but it's crazy. I mean, it's what, 80 years ago, so it's not like you're reading Shakespeare or something, but it's like language has definitely changed, which is always a really interesting side note. But I found it to be a really gripping short story. It was really good.
Yeah, I recently read Fury, a novel by Henry Kuttner from the 40s that takes place like 1,000 years in the future on Venus. And there's a scene where they steal a suitcase full of money, and he says there might be a bomb in the dough. And when when they said in the dough, I was like, that just put it in the
Right.
40s so
Totally.
hardcore. um, yeah, and so here's some interesting things about the story. You know, the outsiders in this story, like one of the things that is, we'll talk about the things that are similar, of course, to the episode. One of the things that's similar about Arena, the short story, and the episode is that the Enterprise and the Federation have not seen the Gorn at this point and don't know what they look like in the beginning, according to the original. And that's where we're going to get into canon about Strange New Worlds. But it's a kind of unseen enemy. So the outsiders, one of the interesting things for me in this story is that the outsider, they've been at war with the outsiders, but nobody really knows what they look like. And that is a detail that I really, really liked about this story, because it sets up this idea that there's this conflict, but also, if you look here on this page, you can see like we're talking about the solar system here. And, you know, like that there were sporadic raids on Earth colonies around the solar system, but there's mention of, you know, Pluto and, you know, which by the way was only discovered what 8 years earlier than the story, which is fascinating to think about. But so when you really think about it, see, I love doing this with the old science fiction is to put your head in 1944 and think about the fact of what existed and what didn't exist. So this story was probably written in 1943-ish, right? And so like, you know, we hadn't been to there, Sputnik hadn't happened yet, right? And so all this space travel and all these things, it's so much more theoretical than where we're at. So that's like an interesting thing. So um also a neat detail for me was the blue sand. Um like the setting, I thought that was like a really neat detail that like kind of really put me in the place of it. But I'm curious, starting with Sarah, what you thought about like kind of the details of the story, and having seen the TOS episode, what was your first reaction to like, you know, kind of, you know, what was unspooling as a different story? And I'm gonna go turn on my light while you're talking.
It's so funny because again, like it's been a couple years. Like I rewatched the episode obviously this week to talk about it, but I read the story first and I just kept going, well, I don't remember that. I don't remember that. I don't remember that. Wow, this is so much more interesting. Wow, this is so much more descriptive. Wow, this is fascinating. Like you just have all of these normal reactions that you would have to, and there are moments where there's anachronism, or like moments where you feel like, oh my gosh, this is definitely written when it was written. But, it's funny, like I feel like even when writers have a sense of describing, like you have to have a frame of reference to what already exists in order to describe it. Even if you have an idea that's so totally out there, in order to describe it to other people, you have to use that frame of reference. And so every time he felt compelled to use that frame of reference, that's when it kind of go, okay, I'm reading a story that's this many years old. But, when he wasn't doing that, it was, it held up. It was really good. And then when I did rewatch the episode again, I was just like, man, they just took the lizard and they sort of plucked various components of it. But if I had been the author and saw what they made from my story, I think even though obviously TOS looked better in the 60s and it wouldn't have been so ridiculous in the 60s. I just would have been like, wow, they really didn't take much.
Yeah. Well, the truth of it is that Gene Kuhn started to write the episode. So it's going to be a point where we get into some about like when we start getting into the background of the episode. But Gene Kuhn had no intention of adapting Arena initially. What happened was they had this episode premiered between Squire of Gothos and Tomorrow is Yesterday. And what happened was they had a whole script ready to go for an episode, and something happened. They didn't think it worked. They didn't have it cracked, and they had a slot where they were filming an episode in early November, and halfway through October, they had no script to film in that slot. So Gene Kuhn was like, all right, I got to write an episode that doesn't require building sets and either takes place entirely on the Enterprise or we don't have to build any sets. So he started to write this episode, and what ended up happening was someone on the staff, and we don't know exactly who it was, but the theory was that it was DC Fontana, said, this is very similar to this very popular science fiction story, Arena. And keep in mind that, obviously the TOS episode happened before the voting that made it the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, but Arena was a very popular story in Astounding. This one was one that the fans talked about, wrote about. It was republished in anthologies very quickly, and Fredric Brown had a reputation. And one of the things that Star Trek, the original series, did that subsequent Star Treks should learn from is they hired actual science fiction writers, and they actually went to science fiction writers who were popular in the science fiction community for stories. Your Harlan Ellisons, your Norman Spinrads, your Richard Mathesons. They wrote episodes, and often they got rewritten. And there's plenty who wrote pitches that didn't get sold, like Avon Books, that they were never able to sell. But what ended up, so the truth is that there were so many similarities, and we'll look at in a little bit the document where they actually reviewed Arena, the story, and Gene Kuhn's script, and said, yeah, we got to give this guy credit and pay him.
Wow.
Because
that explains a lot.
It explains a lot. Yeah. And I have that actual document, so we can look at it here in a few minutes. But
hey guys, technical note, I've switched off the hotel Wi-Fi, so hopefully I won't keep freezing. I apologize.
Okay. Well, I wasn't seeing it too bad on my end, so you're good.
Okay.
Issa, comments on this story. How did it, Sarah feels that it held up. Do you feel that it held up pretty good?
Yeah, I thought the story was great. A couple interesting things. One of the things that really dates it for me, aside from like, specific turns of phrases that are really endemic to a certain time period, but the old science fiction.
Now you did freeze up on me. Maybe switch back to the hotel Wi-Fi. Uh-oh. Well, I will keep talking in the meantime.
Up to knowledge of our modern times. And so you always get these like, he did a great job of sprinkling in the world building, where it was like, this reminds me of a Martian colonist who said the atmosphere here is so thin or whatever, and it's just very, I find that really entertaining always, but I thought
did freeze up on my end, on our end, Issa, but that usually
is
a
full 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Well, I was making amazing points, so I apologize.
Well, here's the funny thing. They normally are still there on the recordings.
Okay, well, that was really profound, so hopefully you got that. No, I'm just kidding. But I won't repeat myself just in case you got it, but I was just saying I like how they talk about the planetary science of they drop facts on different planets that were like known in 1940 or whatever. But then I thought that, so can I talk about the TOS episode, or is it too soon to do that?
Well, we'll get to the TOS episode. So
okay, well, I thought that I was impressed with the changes the TOS episode made. I thought they made a couple really good changes, but there were a few very good things in the story that didn't make it to the TOS thing. Specific.
No.
Oh, there he goes again.
Very specifically. I don't know, Issa.
I don't know what it is about hotels and Wi-Fi, but they're terrible. And so is hotel or planes and Wi-Fi for that matter.
Issa, you froze up again.
Oh, Jesus. All right, I'm going to switch back to the hotel Wi-Fi because for whatever reason, I might disappear for a second. I'm sorry, guys.
That's okay. We can reset a little bit. Yeah, it's the difference is it does actually make for a fun. I mean, adapted science fiction is always fun for that reason. Sometimes comparing the differences and it is amazing to take this story that was already kind of considered a classic and then throw it into this new TV show. It'd be like I don't know. I kind of likened it to well, I don't know. It's kind of like imagine CSI adapting a short story or whatever that was famous already. So, Issa, you were saying about the differences. One of the things that got changed that you
Oh
liked.
yeah, I really liked the kind of mental mystery of trying to solve the puzzle of the barrier and stuff. That was really interesting. And there was, they didn't really have that in the TOS. They the episode had they replaced that with something that wasn't quite as good, but it was I thought that was really cool, and I really enjoyed the story. Like it was a fun. It's like what 18 pages or something, and it was a
Yeah,
fun read.
yeah, yeah. And up on the screen, of course, we had this lizard guy um, that I think he saves the lizard, right? Like
No, he euthanizes the lizard.
euthanizes the lizard from. Yeah, okay. Let me see if there. I think there's a picture of the roller. Um, later, yeah, you can see the roller in the bottom corner there. That drawing. Um, and let's see if there's any other art we need to see.
The art's great. I'm glad I read it before seeing it, but it would have been cool to do simultaneously also.
Yeah. I didn't see it till afterwards because I read it in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And there's the roller yeah, where he's attacking him there at the end. And this is where, sorry for the not for the audio only people, we're looking at the YouTube, or if you can go to the YouTube to see that. And then it ends with an ad for Pepsi Cola.
5-cent Pepsi Cola.
Yeah. So on that note, let's get into the episode. And I have, let's see. I gotta pull up. Hold on, I'm gonna stop share for a second. So let's start with just talking about your general feelings of watching the episode again before before I start making excuses for Star Trek. Because this one, well, first off, what was it? I mean, obviously we've all seen this episode 100 times, right? Right? Everybody's seen it.
Oh yeah.
So starting with Sarah, what was your feelings rewatching it after reading the story? How did it change your viewing experience?
I was almost mad. Like the first, I mean, the first couple times that I watched it, throughout all my history of Star Trek, I was sort of like, this is so hilariously bad. It's sort of charmingly bad. And I feel like after reading the story, instead of feeling like it's charmingly bad, I feel like it's just bad. Because now that I know what, what they potentially could have had, now the explanation that you gave makes a lot more sense. But it's still just like, oh my God, like, and there's just so long, like the first half of it, they're on the ship, not much is happening. And then the entire second half is Kirk fighting this ridiculous sparkly dinosaur character. And it does look like more like a dinosaur than a lizard. In the short story, you get the sense that the lizards are lizard size and they are cute and small. And, he says hello to one and then he says hello back. And even like, I'm like, well, if they had to pay the guy anyway, damn, like that would have been really cool. But yeah, it was just, oh my God. It's just the fight scene just goes on for such a painful length of time. You're just like, oh my God. Like, and even, yes, like Kirk figures out that there's tools and stuff, but it's almost as if we're watching something that hasn't been edited. We are watching Kirk figure out in real time that he can use the minerals and the rocks and everything else that he's got there. But it's just like, oh, it's a painful episode. It's charming because it's hilarious looking, I think, because the creature is just so funny looking. And I love every time I go to the Star Trek cruise.
They knew it too, by the way. You're about to find out that they knew it.
There's always a Gorn. There's always somebody dressed up. I have Gorn earrings and I get it. It's hilarious, but it's just, oh my God.
So Issa, you've actually been to the filming location.
Yeah, Vasquez Rocks, just north of Los Angeles. And it's
Also
great.
the home, also Rafi's house. That's
Yeah,
where her
exactly.
trailer was.
Exactly. No, it's
Many
great.
world.
Everyone should go there. It's so fun because you really feel like you're in the episode and it's hilarious. Um, so I have to explain my history with TOS. So Star Trek was very much a show I watched, or the original series was very much a show I watched whenever it was on, whatever episode happened to be on. And I hadn't watched the whole. I have, as a kid, I never watched the series in order. It was just whatever episode happened to be on that day I was watching it. Um, and I loved it. It was a great show, and I really enjoyed it. Then at some point when I was a little older, probably 30 years ago or so, I watched the whole thing in order, like on a DVD set or a VHS set or something. Um, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But I haven't watched it in 30 years probably. So, I've walked by a TV where it's on, or I've seen like the Tribble episode somewhere or whatever, but I haven't really like sat down and watched an episode of TOS for a really long time, like decades. So, rewatching the episode last night, I was just shocked by, my concept of the original series is colored by like the movies and like the more recent stuff and all the treks that followed. So watching Arena, it's almost like, it's first season of Star Trek. It's almost like proto Trek, like it's
Yeah.
like, they're like, we've got to raise the screens. I'm like, the screens? What the hell are the screens? Do you mean shields?
Right.
Like that is like raising shields is such like a basic Star Trek thing, and they didn't even have that yet, And
This
same with the
episode is the
character.
first time the Federation is mentioned.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And the way the characters were played, they hadn't really developed the characters very well yet. Like now, whatever, 50 years later, these characters have like deep backstories and personalities, and every single thing about them.
Kirk is super aggro in this episode.
But I think the arc, they accentuated that, and I'm just guessing here, you might have some background info, but they accentuated Kirk being super aggressive to make the ending twist work really well. And it did. I thought the ending in the episode was better than the ending in the story. In the story, the human wins and all the aliens just disappear. But, Kirk shows mercy, and then the aliens like, oh, you guys are, humans might be more evolved than I thought or whatever, right? And that was sort of like a more Star Trek-y twist than the other way. I like that. But to make that turnabout work, they make Kirk this like super aggressive, let's go destroy them,
Yeah.
to the point where I was watching and I was like, I didn't remember what happened. It'd been so long since I'd seen the whole episode. I remembered the Gorn part, but I didn't remember the on the ship part. And I was like, is this something where the captain has been taken away and he's been replaced by this warmonger or something? Like I didn't remember. And so
I think
I was
what they mean when people say that Strange New Worlds is like TOS, because they do the same shit in Strange New Worlds where suddenly Spock is completely different. Suddenly Pike is completely different, because all that matters is serving this, the needs of this 40-minute dilemma that needs to be wrapped up very quickly. And so there's a lot of weird character stuff, and it just doesn't flow. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean, but at least like Spock, they have some much more canon to go on. You know what I mean? And Pike too, to a certain degree, but not as much as Spock, obviously. But oh, sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, and it should be noted that we're gonna get into like how they were flying by the seat of their pants for trying to figure out like the characters and all this stuff, and a lot of what was going on, to be honest, with Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana is that Gene Roddenberry was kind of focused on other things at this point. He was very passionate about getting it started, but this is episode 18, and by episode 10, like Roddenberry was running interference with the networks for a lot of it, and he was doing things like chasing down copyrights for the songs that he wrote for Spock to sing in Charlie X to make extra money off marketing. And he was doing a lot of chasing money for extra marketing and Gene Kuhn and Bob Justman and Dorothy Fontana are trying to fix or trying to make this continuity as they're going along. You know, the Federation is mentioned in this episode where he said a bunch of Federation outposts. It's the first time the Federation is ever mentioned. And the Federation is not actually defined until Dorothy Fontana writes Journey to Babel pretty much in the second season. Right.
So I don't want to miss my opportunity to talk about the fight scene. So let me just jump back in and talk about the fight scene. We'll
talk about it more.
It is like the worst fight scene ever to be put on television, in a way that's like, it's so bad that you have to ask questions like, have the people who made this ever seen a fight before? You know, like the first, and it's just the first couple seconds of it, especially. I think it's like the choreography is like, the alien swings really slowly, like really slowly. Kirk dodges out of the way and then does a two-handed punch in the back.
Kirk Fu.
Yeah, exactly. And then he does a karate chop. The same move happens, and he does a karate chop. And it's like, you know how like the first lightsaber fight in Star Wars, like Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi, is sort of like, you know, you go back and you watch it and you're thinking in your head of all the lightsaber fights of the future, and then you see the original and you're like, this is a pretty bad, this is not a very good lightsaber fight. And then, you know, this is like, there's bad Star Trek, you know, like Kirk Fu and stuff, but in the later episodes it got much better. And so this is like, no, much better than this.
Better than this.
Better than this. This is like hilarious. It's like, if I was making like a history of funny fight scenes, like this and the They Live fight would be like the two top things I would put on.
Okay, let's get into some background on this. And so one of the reasons why I have all this research is I wrote a paper for Foundation on DC Fontana, and so to get a lot of the materials for that, I went to the UCLA archive where the Roddenberry papers are stored. And in the Roddenberry papers, you have a lot of the memos, materials between departments for Star Trek. You have scripts, everything. Now, Arena is not a DC Fontana episode, so I had no reason to actually get Arena stuff. I just couldn't help myself. So what we have is just a few pages that I took pictures of because it cracked me up seeing it, because I didn't have any reason to actually look at Arena. I was just going through all the folders and I saw Arena sitting there and I was like, and so I read many more pages of the script than we have pictures for, but I have 2 pages that I took pictures of to work off of, but they're very informative, those 2 pages. And then it makes me want to go back and get more. But one of the things that for future reference, like, and this is all in the DC Fontana article, is that, you know, we have treatments for some of the episodes, and some of the DC Fontana treatments that got rewritten, like, for example, the Way to Eden, the hippie episode, right? Her original treatment for it, which is called Joanna, by the way. Now imagine that the hippie episode, that instead of Chekhov's love interest being the one on the hippie ship, imagine it was McCoy's daughter, Joanna. Better episode, right?
Yeah.
Much better episode. That treatment alone is so much better. Now you can argue the Enterprise incident episode actually has Sarek in it, the one where you know, they steal the Romulan cloaking device. So imagine Sarek was in it, and there was, you know, like, these treatments are very different. So seeing these things, like the Space Seed one, by the way, was originally the original treatment for Space Seed. It wasn't Khan Noonien Singh, it was Erickson, a Viking, right? Which that would change things. That would change things a little bit, right? So that's just to give you context for some of these, you know, like how informative it is to look at these things. So But I want to start with, this is available to anyone. This is the Memory Alpha page for Arena. So it was filmed November 8th, 1966 through November 15th. So it was a 6-day shoot. And you can see here that and this is very important, November 8th, 1966 was on the Desilu stage in LA. So on the studio, they filmed mostly on the bridge, but you'll see that they also filmed that day in the Ready Room. The Ready Room scene where Kirk and Spock argue, that was filmed that day, and we'll see why. So day 2, they were already at Vasquez Rocks, and they were only there for 3 days. 3 days. And then they were and the third day they were doing the fortress set near Vasquez Rocks for the exteriors for Cestus 3. So that's all really important stuff to keep in mind when we look at this stuff. So these are my folders. So this is my Arena folder.
One more thing real quick, David. The transport scene where Scotty transports them down was very emotive. Like,
yeah,
he played those transporter keys like a fine instrument. It was really entertaining.
Yeah. So look at the date on this script. November 8th, 1966. Day 1 of filming. So see all these marks and changes? Day 1 of filming.
Yeah.
And what you have here is that so you can see here, this is where they're watching. This is McCoy and Spock watching, and Spock's dialogue where they have him saying an invention, doctor, and he scratches out sulfur, and they just change the order. First, what, I don't know what that word is, and then if you can find sulfur. And so think about all these scenes where we were watching, Leonard Nimoy do. Yes, if he could find sulfur. They literally had a guy with a pen off camera, like handwriting this shit and handing it to Leonard Nimoy, which is fucking hilarious.
That is really funny.
Think about it.
Especially that whole scene is funny too, because he doesn't just say it a couple of times. You feel like that scene also goes on. And since I am aware of the Spirk community, the the sort of the number of people who ship Kirk and Spock, this scene is hilarious because Spock looks like he is about to just absolutely, he looks very, very amorously as Kirk solves this, and it's almost as, it's funny because
look right here,
they're still trying to figure out the characters and everything, but knowing all of the jokes and all of the memes and everything now, it's almost an uncomfortable scene because you feel like people should be looking at Spock and going, okay, he's figuring it out, dude, like, calm down.
Well, and look how it's written here at the top. Spock is jubilant, watching. Jubilant. Well, first of all,
jubilant. That's crazy. That's why it sticks out so funny. It's just
I know. And there's one other line, I think, where it says something about down at the bottom, Spock is growing increasingly more jubilant. So his injubilance is increasing, according to Gene Kuhn. And then
weren't emotionless yet.
Yeah, and so here he moves. You can see that they're moving, like they're showing Kirk. He wants to move this line of dialogue of the Gorn speaking till after Kirk finds the diamonds. So like at that moment, he's like literally drawing an arrow to say, put it here. And it's Captain, let us be reasonable. Surely you are tired of this as I am. Stay in one place. Now, that line about stay in one place did not make it to the final cut, but it's funny just seeing, like, come on, Captain, be reasonable. Stay in one place. That made me laugh when I read that. So let's see. Okay, so now this is an important one. So these changes happened on the 15th. Okay. So the filming started on the 8th. This is the last day of filming. And you can look, and let me zoom in on this. This is the argument between Spock and Kirk, where he gets all like riled up. And look how much of this is literally fucking handwritten in the moment. Like if initially, and you see what they were trying to change, because initially Kirk and Spock agree more, right? Because Spock is originally saying, he just says invasion, Mr. Kirk says invasion, Mr. Spock, a clear and immediate threat. And then kind of Spock is like not really arguing with him, but then they change the Kirk dialogue to where he says, I have all the proof I need down on Cestus 3. That's handwritten, instead of saying, of course it's obvious. So if you go back and watch the episode, you'll because I went back and watched the scene after looking at this. It's 12 minutes in, and after looking at this and seeing Kirk say, I got all the proof I need on Cestus 3, and it's like, fuck, that was handwritten, right? And one of the things that's really interesting is if you go down here, there is dialogue that Nimoy didn't do, right? So this line down here that Spock is saying, the idea of killing always bothers me, Captain. Still, there are a few alternatives. And Kirk says there's no alternatives. That's all cut, right?
That was actually good lines. Like that was.
But if you go back and watch the scene, Nimoy is really selling like that Spock is bothered by all this.
Yeah.
If you go back and watch, like, and I guarantee you, Nimoy is standing there going, no, I'm not saying this. We don't need to say this. Just put a camera on me and I will look bothered. Right? But it is fucking just insane. When I've watched this episode, like 30 times, and never in my life did I think that lines like, I have all the proof I need down on Cestus 3 were fucking handwritten with a pencil.
Yeah,
right?
It's pretty great.
It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Okay, so when it says at the top, DeForest research, that doesn't mean DeForest Kelly's research. The guy who actually did the science advising, his last name was DeForest, I think.
That's interesting.
Yes. And so, excuse me.
I thought it was like, fine, you can play the doctor, but you also have to do the research.
Yeah. No, it's not that. But so almost every episode, you'll see in the files, there's the DeForest research. And he'll say things like, if the ship went that fast within a certain amount of seconds, everyone would turn to jelly. Like on that, like, and like all the things where he's like, like saying, all the science advisory stuff is all in his research. So, but what they asked him to do was to give an opinion, and this is in October still, so they haven't started filming. Arena story outline by Gene Kuhn and Arena short story by Fredric Brown contain the following substantive similarities. This is the document where they decided, should we pay the guy? And so the similarities include aliens attacking Earth colonies, imminent battle between Earth and aliens, intervention of third highly advanced intellect, instant transportation of Earthman and alien to unarmed to arena on asteroid. 5, single combat to determine which race survives. 6, the quality of mercy being a decisive factor in the outcome. I don't remember that from the short story. I guess when he saves the or when he euthanizes the lizard is more what I think what they're thinking.
I don't think the number 6 is one of the differences of the stories, I would say, not a similarity, because
no, he does the differences next.
Right, but I think number 6 of the similarities is actually a mistake. I thought that was a big change in
I agree.
Star Trek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get with it, DeForest.
Seriously.
There are the following differences. In the details of the storytelling, Act 1 and Act 2 of the Coon Arena, recounting the first Earth alien encounters and the intervention of the third party, is told in flashback in the Brown Arena. The details of single combat in Coon Arena, the intervening intellect provides weapons which test only Kirk's ingenuity, and Brown's the intervening intellect provides no weapons but supplies a force field and raw materials to test ingenuity. In Coon Arena, Kirk is merciful to the alien which saves him, and Brown Arena, Carson is merciful to the intelligent lizard which reveals to him the way through the barrier. In our opinion, Coon's Arena is substantially similar to the copyrighted story Arena by Fredric Brown. The airing of a screenplay from this outline without purchase to the Brown story could be actionable.
Would be actionable. Like, you're getting sued. Or, film this, you're getting sued. Air this, you're getting sued.
And you can see here they paid somebody to write a synopsis of the short story. I ain't got time to read. I ain't got to read no short story. Just pay somebody to type it up. So I took a picture of that because I did think that was funny. And now this is great. You're gonna love this one. Now, some of the best memos are from Bob Justman. Bob Justman, who is a producer, is fucking hilarious. And his memos throughout all of these are they're always a zinger. And the guy had no fucks to give, and he was brutally honest. So if you wrote something stupid, he was going to tell you it was stupid, and he wasn't going to sugarcoat it. So Bob Justman's memos are just great. The Gorn, okay. So this is his notes. The Gorn looking up in surprise at the off-screen boulder approaching to him in scene 100, with Kirk leaping to his feet and looking over just after we hear the off-screen crash of the boulder hitting. I don't know what he was saying. He was just saying, I think he was telling him, like, you got to put that off screen. So, and I'm sorry it cuts off on the side. I did not take a good picture of this one. Let's see. I think you better not have Kirk with his club. It would kill him. So I think what he's saying is there was originally in the script, he was going to get clubbed by the Gorn, and Justman's like, no way, dude, that's going to totally kill Kirk. It's like, you can't have him hit him with that. He often talks about the narration not being needed here. And then he asks the question, why does Kirk throw more rocks at the Gorn in scenes 138 and 135? He was previously unable to cause any damage. So he's basically saying, like, why would he keep throwing rocks at him?
Right. They cut that. He doesn't throw any more rocks after he crushes him with the giant boulder and he doesn't die. But I like on page 49, if the Gorn is as clumsy as I think it's going to be.
That's exactly what I was going to get to.
He throws rocks, and then he just keeps finding bigger rocks. And only when he throws that huge rock, which, by the way, if you rolled a rock and you weren't able to actually control its trajectory, you just push it up and it magically lands where it needs to land.
Yeah, this is not the best Bob Justman notes of all the ones I've seen, but believe it or not, there's ones where he writes like more intense notes. And Gene Kuhn, for his part too, his first reaction to Norman Spinrad's first script, The Planet Eater that became Doomsday Machine, is 16 pages. He had 16 pages of notes of things he had to change in the Doomsday Machine. So they were all, they could get that way. And by the way, my favorite note that Gene Kuhn gave Norman Spinrad on Doomsday Machine is that in the script, they beamed onto the other ship and everyone got out their tricorders and started scanning. And he said, we only have 2 tricorders, so you can only have two crewmen with tricorders, which is fucking great. So if you're ever in a Star Trek trivia contest and they ask how many tricorders did they have for filming, it was 2. And so now when I watch original series episodes, I'm always looking at the tricorders, because what they do sometimes is they'll cut and they'll do a cut where they basically must have handed the tricorder to another actor and had them stand there with the tricorder. So it looked like, but you'll notice now the cuts. So they're making up for the 2 tricorders. I swear to you, I see it all the time now. I can't not see it. But I think this shit is charming because this is showing these are just real people just trying to make a goddamn science fiction show on Lucille Ball's studio lot, in 1966. So it's pretty fun to look at this stuff. Any thoughts, starting with Sarah, on what this means to you to see this material?
Well, it's just interesting. I mean, it explains a lot because this episode is a mess. Like it isn't just that it's dated, it's that it's really hard to imagine watching it back then. And I realized the bar was significantly lower, but it's just like, how is this not just incredibly silly to them? And so I think that's why it's interesting to watch, old stuff.
But Bob Justman said, as clumsy as I know that suit's going to be, he knew it was going to look stupid. And that's the proof right there. Yeah, he fucking knew it. And
the interesting thing to me is is just, it's really important to remember that Star Trek is this cultural phenomena now, but when they were filming this, I guarantee there was no one who was working on this who was like, in 50 years, people will be talking about this. You know what I mean? Like, this was like, I mean, it's like, take anything from our modern lives where you put in some effort, you worked on something, but you didn't really think it was going to be like, to mean anything necessarily. Imagine
I will push back on that a little bit, because they were on network TV, and network TV back then was one of 4 channels.
Yeah.
Or 3.
I think they were also, weren't they on like on the bubble of being canceled at all times? That's my impression.
Season 3, they were on the verge the whole time.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, still, I can't imagine that any of them in their wildest dreams thought Star Trek would have the impact that it's had over the past 50 years. Like, I would be shocked if anyone was like, this is going to be huge. We have to put all our effort in and make this perfect because people will be doing podcasts about this in 50 or 60 years,
Right.
Like, I just think there wasn't that sense of, it's almost rare. I mean, why would you ever have a TV show where you felt that way, But
yeah,
it is, I think it's my favorite thing when, when people who hate the new stuff talk about Star Trek. And they talk about Gene Roddenberry, especially. They have this they have, just built a statue of him in their minds where Gene Roddenberry planned out everything meticulously and had a vision from the very beginning. And I'm like, motherfucker, he made shit up as he went. So did the rest of them. And, but they don't believe it. They're like, no, he knew. It's just like.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, and if you look at, I mean, like, one of the funny things too, like Amok Time, for example, which, is, the Ponfar and all that. Um, there's one note from DC Fontana that is still affecting Star Trek from an inner office memo. It's not her episode. Theodore Sturgeon wrote that episode. And he sent in the episode, the first draft of the episode, and Roddenberry, Kuhn, everybody was like, hey, everybody, read this episode, give us your thoughts. And DC Fontana says, it's really dumb to have this random, we've never seen her before, yeoman be heartbroken over Spock getting married when we already introduced Christine Chapel having a crush on him. Yeah. So it's really dumb. You gotta make that Christine Chapel. And I don't know. And basically was just like saying, like, if you're gonna have somebody heartbroken over Spock getting married, then it's got to be Christine Chapel.
Yeah.
And think about that. It's still affecting Strange New Worlds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was just a memo of her just reading the script and saying, no, like, don't just, because they were just going to, Sturgeon just made up some yeoman Maggie or something. And that would have been her one scene, is she gets the plumix soup thrown at her. And that's her entry into Star Trek. But in this one note, and this is one of the things that's so fascinating about reading all these notes. And like I said, the Bob Justman ones are just ridiculously hilarious. Like his I know with Charlie X, he made a note about Shatner's pants that he was wearing in the workout room. And then he like literally said something like, Shatner approved those pants. Fucking hilarious. And it's funny because I looked at all these like books, behind the scenes books and things like that, and I'm like, no one commented on that, but when I'm flipping through all these things that I see Bob Justman saying Shatner approved those pants, I noticed that. Right. And I'm like, man, all you people missed all that. Anyways, so any last thoughts on the story, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame entry? Usually what I try to do with some of these is I usually have people that are like big experts on these authors and say, do they have another story that you think fits better for the Hall of Fame? But I think we all agree this story is worthy of being in something called the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, correct? Does everyone agree with that?
Oh yeah. And I would frankly love to see Strange New Worlds handle this story straight on, like actually do Arena. I would fucking love that. I would be so happy. So
with the new Gorn, with like the ability that
with the new Gorn, I mean, obviously they can't do it as the introduction to the Gorn because they've already done the Gorn, but they could fix that part pretty easily. But like, I would love to see this story developed for modern day television.
Yeah, well, I mean, somebody could do an adaptation of Arena. It doesn't have to be in Star Trek.
Yeah,
that's the thing. There was an Outer Limits episode that that was so close to this that Fredric Brown got a settlement out of court, and that episode of Outer Limits is called Fun and Games. If you want to watch that, because Outer Limits was great. But yeah, Fredric Brown, died by the 70s. But I think it is another sign of that Star Trek was taking science fiction seriously at the time, that they were hiring these writers. And I think for hardcore science fiction fans, when they turned on the episode and it said Arena based on the story by Fredric Brown, I bet you a lot of science fiction fans' jaws dropped. Like, oh, no way. I read that story in Astounding in 1944 or whatever. I mean, these magazines lived on, right? And again, Arena was anthologized many times afterwards, so it wasn't just in Astounding that people read it. But Issa, you think this story deserves to be in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame?
Yeah, I would say if you haven't read it, take 20 minutes and read it. It's online and it's really good.
Yeah. And there's pretty good audio versions on YouTube. One of the things about all these old classic science fiction stories is there's tons of like just actors that are amateur audiobook readers, like reading old science fiction stories to get stuff for their portfolio or for and so there's lots of really good audio versions of these old science fiction stories, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I like listening to those while I'm reading them. And yeah, so on that note, just some things that I want to highlight to people. I don't know who I'm going to do for the guests next time, but the next 2 episodes of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, we've got the next 3 are doozies. I mean, they're all Science Fiction Hall of Fame stories, right? But we've got Murray Leinster, First Contact. But the one after that, and this is a big one, is Judith Merrill's Only a Mother. That Only a Mother. And that Judith Merrill story is so good. So good. And Judith Merrill, for those who don't know, was an anarchist, Trotskyist in the 30s, member of the Futurians. She became she left the United States over the Vietnam War in the 60s and stayed in Canada until her death. And she used to be the host of Doctor Who in the 80s in Canada. They called her the Undoctor. And she hosted Doctor Who on Canadian TV, which is amazing. And she donated all of her science fiction collection to the Toronto Library, and it's called the Spaced Out Library. And if you go to Toronto and visit it, her only stipulation was they had to put a bed in there that you can lay down and read. So Judith Merrill is super cool. That's 2 episodes away. So I highly recommend people. And if you don't already have the entire Science Fiction Hall of Fame, it's a really good book. But unfortunately, Judith Merrill is only the 2nd woman that we have in the Hall of Fame, and she will be the last, unfortunately, because of the sexist voting. So we had Catherine Lucille Moore for Mimsy Were the Boroughgroves, and we will have Judith Merrill. So just want to put that out there. So if you want to get ahead and read those stories, those are coming up. And I'm sure Issa and I will be back. Well, first of all, Issa and I are doing our best movies of the year with Anthony later this month.
It's going to be a good one.
Yes. And I want to put a shout out there for this book, Where the Silent Ones Watch, which is an amazing tribute anthology to William Hope Hodgson, who was a science fiction, fantasy, and horror writer from 1906 to he died in the First World War. And this is a tribute anthology, and I have a story in this anthology, but that's not why you should buy it, because there's a ton of other awesome people in it. But yeah, I have a story in there. This is great. Sarah, Issa, starting with Sarah, do you want people to find you?
I mean, I can be found ranting on Facebook about the current state of the U.S. political reality that we suddenly find ourselves in. The shit show. So
well, we will be back in a couple weeks because lower decks is almost done. So we'll be back for Lower Decks here soon. You're watching week to week, right, Sarah?
No, because I mean I normally would be, but the current shit show has reduced my general mental health and productivity to about 50%. So, it's
all right.
It's affected my work. It's affected my free time. So we'll see.
Well,
I'm going to Zurich. I'm going to Montreal. I'm going to Zurich. So, but we'll see.
Well, Lower Decks, you guys, spoiler alert, I liked one of the episodes a lot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I
And you
Yeah.
guys know I'm not a huge Lower Decks person, but there's one episode that I thought really, really felt more like Star Trek and wasn't breaking the fourth wall the whole time. And the fourth wall breaking is the thing that kind of bothers me. Like,
Really?
I
That
don't like.
bothers you? The thing that bothers me the most is that I'm old and I need them to slow down. I find it somewhat tiring. I'm like, I don't know if I have the energy to watch this because my brain just can't keep up. I need them to slow down. I wish it was like, you know how when you watch a video online, you can like speed it up or slow it.
Yeah,
I need that for real streaming.
you need it to. They need to slow down Lower Decks a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
know.
I agree. Sometimes the speed gets a bit much for me. But yeah, there is one episode that I actually had the thought afterwards, like, wow, I actually really like that episode, and I haven't seen this week's yet. But I do want to put a shout out there for Star Wars Skeleton Crew is amazing, and they've absolutely 200% captured the Amblin in the Star Wars universe. It is absolutely Goonies in Star Wars, and they
Excellent.
fucking nailed it.
Is it like aimed at kids? I haven't heard too much about it. It's
So it's
kids.
a Gen X bait, you're saying. You're that's what
Yeah,
you're
no,
telling
it
me.
is Stranger Things or Goonies set in the Star Wars universe.
Okay.
Jude Law is in it, and it's from the guy who directed the Spider-Man trilogy and Cop Car, like John Watts. And
Oh. Okay.
let me tell you, oh, and the Daniels directed a couple episodes, and the guy who directed the Green Knight directed two episodes. But what is amazing is they've done a totally amazing job of making something feel fresh and new in Star Wars, but also feel like Star Wars at the same time. But at the same time, you're like, oh my God, this is so Amblin. This is so 80s. And it's spinning a lot of plates, but it works on everything. And if nothing else, you want to watch it because they've actually. So you remember the werewolf in Mos Eisley
Uh-huh.
that Lucas cut out because it was so embarrassing?
Okay.
They made a major character out of that species,
God. Okay.
and it works.
Okay. All right. I'll watch it. I'll get around to it. But I will binge watch Lower Decks right before I'll plan to finish right before our episode.
Okay. Well, and on that note, we'll see everybody for that. Sorry for the little bit of Star Wars talk. But yeah, Sarah, I totally feel you. I understand it. If I hadn't had 30 years of swallowing the misery of being a vegan in this society, I'd probably be more affected by it. But
No, I mean I do understand the veganism thing, but it really is very different when you are being targeted. And
yeah.
there I totally get the comparison if you're talking about, for instance, I don't know, like the persecution of Black people,
Mhm.
something I cannot understand. I can have as much empathy as I can. I have so much, I see what's going on in the food industry with animals, and it's absolutely heartbreaking and disgusting. And, it feels overwhelming. There's nothing you can do to fix it. But it is very physically affecting when it is personally affecting your bodily autonomy, your
Oh no,
ability
I get it.
to
And
feel
that
safe in your skin. You are the one, you are the animal in the pen. And,
well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the end of the Bush era was so tough, because I was doing more activism at the time, and I had more direct reasons to be um feeling
I
those
mean,
things at the
they
time.
had Ronan Farrow on, I think, the Daily Show, or one of those cable, shows that are sort of somewhat funny and somewhat edutainment, if you will. But
Yeah.
he was talking about, he was giving advice for activists, and he was saying, wrap your laptops in tinfoil everywhere you go. And this is a mainstream show Ronan
Yeah.
Farrow, respected guy. He was also
Absolutely.
saying, turn off your phones at night. Don't plug them in and leave them on while you're asleep. And I'm just like, oh my God, like things have already gotten to that point. It's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. That I'm not. I have never told it. I've been. I think I told you privately when we that at work that I got called Debbie Downer because I was just like refusing to allow people to give me silver lining talk. I was just like,
Yeah.
no,
I can't stand it when people
stop it,
say,
Issa.
oh, it'll be fine.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys.
I'm
No, it's
also very jealous though, because it sounds like you can sleep. So that's a good thing. I have not been sleeping normally. So
Yeah, I just
Kyle is very healthy for your physically.
well, on that note, I do think you know, maybe lower decks could help take an edge off. I don't know. But nothing can. I know. I'm gonna stop before I make it any worse. But for those of you who have sat with us and commiserated at the end here, just keep in mind we you know love to talk about this nerdy stuff. So if you have any thoughts on Arena, you can drop a line in the comments on the show, and I will do my best to keep after them. But yes, please do listen to the next episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame and return for our Star Trek roundtables. So we'll be back for Lower Decks as a crew. I'm working on a fourth chair for Lower Decks. I have some ideas, but it's funny. The Star Trek authors are so afraid to come on, dude, because they don't want to say anything negative. They don't want to be caught saying anything negative.
I
And
know.
yeah, and it's very funny because like they're all like, I kind of don't want to talk about that publicly. You don't want to make Secret Hideout mad. And I get it. I get it. All right. On that note, folks, we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us. And I'm always bad at ending these. So we'll see you next time.